The last thread of autumn sunlight bled through the tall, arched window of the king's study, striking dust motes that danced like tiny gilded ghosts in the air between them. It was a light that promised endings, the slow, graceful death of the year. But Damon saw none of it. He saw only the papers on his desk, the intricate maps of his kingdom, the neat columns of figures that spoke of harvest yields and trade tariffs. He saw the world he commanded, a world of facts and figures, of stone and steel. He did not see the shadow standing patiently by the door, the one that had been there for years, silent and essential. Sarah had learned the language of his moods through the set of his shoulders. Today, they were granite. "Your Grace," she began, her voice a low, steady thing, a river stone worn smooth by years of use. It was the only sound in the room besides the scratch of his quill. He didn't look up, his pale hand, paler than any living man's, moving across the parchment with inhuman precision. "What is it, Sarah? I'm occupied." "It is Lord Theron," she said, her gaze fixed not on Damon, but on the way the dying light caught the sharp edges of the letter opener on his desk, turning it to a sliver of blood. A substance the Nightborn King no longer needed for sustenance, but one his subjects still required. And the grain shipments to the northern garrisons. The whispers from the barracks are growing louder. They speak of a lion with no fangs. She paused, gathering her courage for what she had to say next. "And there is something else, something I only just confirmed through my contacts in the Southern Archives. The Theron family, 3 generations ago, they were hunters. They specialized in tracking and killing Nightborn. Theron's great-grandfather was legendary for it, before the family sought legitimacy through service instead of slaughter." Damon's quill stopped. He finally lifted his head, and the impatience in his eyes was a physical force, a wall she had run into 1,000 times before. His face, which she had once thought of as something carved by gods, seemed merely hard now, the lines around his mouth etched by certitude, not wisdom. His red eyes, the mark of his ancient bloodline, gleamed in the fading light. His long silver hair caught the last rays of sunset, making him appear almost ethereal despite his irritation. "Ancient history," he said dismissively. "The Theron family has served faithfully for 3 generations. One does not condemn a man for his ancestors' profession." Whispers, and now genealogy. "You come to me again with shadows." "Shadows are where daggers are hidden," she replied, her voice unwavering. "Even from those who dwell in darkness. The grain shipments are false, the garrisons are starving, and a family that once hunted your kind does not forget the methods. They only wait for the opportunity. Theron has been meeting with the border lords. Secretly. He is fanning a flame that will consume us all." He set the quill down with a sharp click that echoed in the quiet room. He stood, and even after centuries of existence, the sheer size of him, the innate authority he wore like a mantle, filled the space. The Nightborn were known for their commanding presence, and Damon was no exception. His pale skin seemed to glow in the dying light, his red eyes fixed on her with an intensity that would have frightened most mortals. "Theron is my most trusted advisor. He has served my father and his father before him. Through 3 generations of mortal advisors, his family has proven loyal. You, on the other hand, bring me these phantoms, these anxieties. Every week, a new conspiracy, a new imagined threat." He walked around the desk, his boots silent on the thick carpet. He stopped before her, so close she could feel the unnatural coolness radiating from his body, see the flecks of deeper crimson in his red eyes. "I have a kingdom to run, Sarah, a real one. I deal with tangible problems. I cannot afford to be distracted by your paranoia." The word landed like a stone in the pit of her stomach. Paranoia. It was a cold, clinical word, a dismissal not just of her warning, but of her very nature. For 12 years, since she was a slip of a girl and he a newly crowned Nightborn king, she had been his shadow. She had moved through the castle's hidden ways, listening. She had cultivated spies in the kitchens and the stables. She had intercepted the silver dart meant for his heart 3 years ago, her own hand burned by the blessed metal for a week. She had quietly removed the hunter who had scaled the east tower with wooden stakes, burying the weapons in consecrated ground where they could never be used again. She had diverted the forged missive that would have sent his armies on a fool's errand to the south. She had spent weeks in the southern archives, traveling in secret, confirming the Theron bloodline, tracing their hunter heritage, gathering the proof he would never believe. She had been the invisible shield between him and the 1,000 sharp edges of the world, edges designed specifically to harm the Nightborn. He saw none of it. He saw only a woman who bothered him with whispers. "It is not paranoia," she said, her throat tight. The effort to keep her voice even was immense. "It is the truth. Look closer. See what is in front of you." His jaw tightened. He saw her as a duty, an odd inheritance from his father, who had seen something in the orphaned girl with the watchful eyes. A stray he was obliged to keep. "I see what is in front of me," he said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous command that carried the weight of immortal authority. "And I am telling you that I have had enough. I have indulged these fantasies of yours for too long. No more. Do you understand me? Stop bothering me." Each word was a nail hammered into the coffin of her service. She had sworn an oath to his father on his deathbed, an oath to watch over the brilliant, reckless, and utterly blind son he was leaving behind. She had kept that oath. She had sacrificed a normal life, friendships, the possibility of love, all to be his unseen guardian against threats both mortal and designed specifically for the Nightborn. And he called it a fantasy. Something inside her, a cord of devotion that had been fraying for years, finally snapped. It made no sound, but she felt the severing as a profound and sudden emptiness. She looked at his face, at the cold certainty there, and for the first time she did not see the boy she had sworn to protect. She saw an immortal being who was a stranger to her and a fool to himself. She gave him the slightest of nods. It was a gesture of acquiescence, of obedience, but it felt like a declaration of war. Or perhaps of peace. Her peace. "As you wish, Your Grace." She turned and walked away, her back straight. She did not look back. She did not see him run a hand through his long silver hair in frustration, already turning his mind back to his tariffs and maps, dismissing her as a solved problem. She walked out of the study, the heavy oak door closing behind her with a soft, final thud. The sound echoed in her own hollow chest. She had been his shield for 12 years, protecting an immortal who should have been able to protect himself. And now she was putting it down. He was on his own. She wondered, with a strange and terrifying calm, how long it would take for the hunters and conspirators to find him, now that the gate was open. The first 2 weeks were unnervingly quiet. For Damon, it was a relief. The silence in his council chambers felt productive, not fraught with the unspoken tensions Sarah's presence always seemed to create. Lord Theron was more efficient than ever, his reports crisp, his advice sound. The kingdom, it seemed, ran much more smoothly without the constant hum of imagined threats. Damon worked through the nights, as all Nightborn did, their bodies requiring no sleep, fueled by a sense of vindication. He had been right. It had all been in her head. The world was exactly as it appeared on his maps, ordered, understandable, under his control. He felt a prickle of something that might have been guilt when he thought of her, of the harshness in his voice that last day. But he pushed it down. It was for the best, for both of them. Sarah, for her part, experienced those 2 weeks as a slow, painful unfurling. The hypervigilance that had been her constant companion for over a decade began to recede, leaving behind an aching exhaustion. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to sleep through the night, no longer keeping the nocturnal hours of the Nightborn court. She found a small, abandoned groundskeeper's cottage at the farthest edge of the castle estate, near the Whispering Woods, and began to make it her own. She swept out the dead leaves, patched the roof, and planted a small herb garden. They were simple, physical tasks, and she lost herself in them. She did not listen at doors. She did not watch the shadows. She did not ask her network of kitchen maids and stable boys for news. She had been ordered to stop, and she obeyed. The silence was both a balm and a torment. It was the peace she had never had, and the sound of a coming doom she was forcing herself to ignore. The end came on the 19th day. It began, as Sarah had warned, with a gift, but not wine. Theron had learned centuries ago that liquid refreshment held no appeal for the Nightborn. Instead, it was blood. Fresh, from a willing donor in the Southern Territories, Theron explained at the small, intimate meeting in the king's private chambers, a gesture of goodwill to celebrate a new trade agreement. Damon accepted the crystal vial, examining it in the candlelight. The blood within was dark and rich, its scent appealing. It had been weeks since he'd taken sustenance. The Nightborn could go months without feeding when necessary, but this seemed appropriate for a celebration. "To your counsel, my friend," Damon said, raising the vial to his lips. "You have been steadfast. My father knew your worth, and so do I." Theron inclined his head, his smile thin. "I serve the throne, your grace. Always." Damon drank. The blood should have brought the familiar warmth, the brief surge of vitality that sustained his kind. Instead, there was something else. Something wrong. A burning began in his throat, spreading like liquid silver through his veins. His red eyes widened in shock. "The blood," he managed, looking at the vial, then at Theron. His immortal body, which should have been impervious to most poisons, was suddenly failing him. The advisor's face was a mask of polite concern, but his eyes held a flicker of triumph. "Is something amiss, your grace?" And then the pain hit, a fire that only one substance could cause: silver. Somehow, impossibly, Theron had infused the blood with liquefied silver, blessed and concentrated. It was burning him from the inside, attacking the very essence of what made him Nightborn. He doubled over, his usually pale skin taking on an ashen, gray tint. He looked up at Theron, his vision blurring, and through the haze of agony he saw the truth. The meetings, the grain shipments, the whispers, the hunter heritage. Sarah's face swam before his eyes, her expression earnest and worried. Shadows are where daggers are hidden. As he fell to his knees, an immortal brought low, another figure stepped from the alcove behind the tapestry. It was Captain Vorlag, the head of his personal guard, a man Damon would have trusted with his eternal life. Vorlag's face was grim. He did not draw his sword to defend his king. Instead, he drew a long, thin stake of ashwood from his belt, the one wood that could truly harm the Nightborn. Damon tried to stand, to call for help, but the silver in his system had locked his muscles, stolen his supernatural strength. He could only watch, helpless, as Vorlag approached. He saw the captain's mouth move, but the words were lost in the roaring in his ears. He felt a searing, white-hot line of pain as the stake plunged into his shoulder, deliberately missing his heart, prolonging his agony. The shock of it momentarily cleared his head. He stared at the blood, darker than human blood, blooming across the front of his tunic, a dark, impossible flower. Betrayal. It was a physical thing, ashwood in the shoulder, silver in the veins. He collapsed onto the floor, the Aubusson carpet rough against his cheek. Through dimming red eyes, he saw Theron step over him, his face impassive. "The Nightborn king is dead," the advisor said to the captain, his voice calm, as if discussing the weather. "An unfortunate attack by hunters. See to it that the castle is secured. The border lords will be here by morning to legitimize the transition to mortal rule." The last thing Damon heard before the darkness took him was the distant, chilling sound of the castle's alarm bells beginning to ring, not in warning, but in proclamation. And beneath it, a fainter sound, a memory of a voice, low and steady, a voice he had silenced. It is not paranoia. It is the truth. The world returned to him in flashes of red and black. Red was the fire, the hungry, roaring beast that was eating his home. Fire, the ancient enemy of the Nightborn. Black was the suffocating smoke that filled his lungs, the endless void he kept slipping into. He was being dragged. The rough stones of a corridor scraped against his back. The pain in his shoulder was a constant, screaming agony, the ashwood still burning in his flesh like a brand. He opened his eyes, red irises struggling to focus, and saw the face of a boy, a kitchen hand named Tom, his young face streaked with soot and terror. "Your Grace, we have to move!" the boy yelled over the roar of the flames. Loyalty. It was here, in the terrified grip of a mortal scullery boy, not in the feigned smiles of his advisors and captains. The thought was a shard of glass in his mind. He tried to get his feet under him, but his legs wouldn't obey. The silver was still in him, a leaden poison in his immortal veins. "Leave me," Damon rasped, his throat raw. "Save yourself. I am Nightborn. I am already damned." "Never, Your Grace," the boy grunted, heaving him forward. "You are our king, Nightborn or not." They were in the service tunnels, the hidden arteries of the castle that Damon hadn't known existed. But someone had. Sarah. She had shown them to a few of the lower staff, the ones she trusted. The invisible, loyal ones. A contingency plan. For him. Even for an immortal, she had planned for the impossible. They stumbled out of a hidden exit behind the armory, into a courtyard filled with smoke and the clash of steel. Men in his own livery were fighting each other, brother against brother, guard against guard. Vorlag's men, the traitors, were cutting down the loyalists with brutal efficiency. The castle was falling. His kingdom was falling. And somewhere in the chaos, he could hear the chanting of hunters, those who hunted the Nightborn, their voices raised in ancient verses meant to bind and burn his kind. The boy, Tom, pushed him toward the stables. "My sister works here. She has horses ready." The stable was chaos. Horses screamed in their stalls, their eyes wide with terror as embers rained down from the burning roof, the animals sensing the unnatural presence of fire and Nightborn in close quarters. A young girl, no older than 15, was holding the reins of 2 frantic destriers. She saw them, and her face, pale with fear, flooded with relief. "Hurry!" she cried. They managed to haul Damon onto the back of one of the horses. Every movement sent waves of fire through his shoulder where the ashwood had pierced him. He clung to the saddle horn, his supernatural strength reduced to barely more than a mortal's. He could hear shouting behind them. Vorlag's men had spotted them. An arrow, tipped with silver, hissed past his ear. Tom slapped the rump of Damon's horse. "Go, ride for the Tanglewood. They won't follow you in there at night. The old magic protects it, even from the Nightborn." The boy then turned, drawing a pathetic short sword from his belt, and stood between them and the approaching soldiers. A mortal boy facing down trained killers to buy his immortal king a few more seconds of life. Damon's horse bolted, carrying him out of the burning courtyard and into the cold, dark night. He looked back, just for a second. He saw Tom fall. He saw the castle, his home, his world, engulfed in a shroud of fire and betrayal. Fire, the element that could reduce even the Nightborn to ash. He saw the culmination of every warning he had ever ignored. He rode, not with purpose but in a desperate flight, his immortal body struggling to heal around the ashwood still lodged in his shoulder. He rode toward the only person in the world who had tried to save him, the person he had sent away. He rode toward Sarah. The sun was a pale, hesitant wound on the horizon when he finally slid from the horse's back. He didn't so much dismount as fall, his body giving out completely. The dawn light burned his pale skin, not fatally, not like the legends said, but with an uncomfortable warmth that reminded him how weakened he was. He crawled toward the shade of the trees, the smell of leaf mold and dew filling his senses. His fine tunic was torn and blackened, his shoulder a mess of darker blood where the ashwood had pierced him. The silver was still in his system, preventing his supernatural healing. Behind him, his horse stood trembling, its flanks heaving, foam at its mouth. The beast had carried him through the night, following some instinct toward the whispering woods, toward safety. He pushed himself up, crawling the last few feet to the door of the small stone cottage. It was humble, mortal, simple, everything his Gothic castle was not. A curl of smoke rose from its chimney, a life he had shattered. He knocked, his fist weak against the solid wood. He heard movement inside, then the scraping of a bolt being drawn. The door opened. Sarah stood there, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders against the morning chill. Her hair was unbound, falling over her shoulders in a dark wave. She held a small paring knife in one hand, the one she'd been using to slice apples for her breakfast, mortal food he could never share. Her eyes, those unnervingly perceptive eyes, took him in. The blood, darker than human blood. The grime, the exhaustion, the utter ruin of him. The proud, night-born king brought to his knees. There was no shock on her face. There was no surprise. There was only a deep, profound, and terrible stillness. It was the calm of someone who had been watching the sky, waiting for a storm she knew was coming, and was now simply observing the wreckage it had left behind. He opened his mouth to speak, but what could he say? You were right? The words were so small, so laughably inadequate for the catastrophe that had unfolded. He tried to get to his feet, to face her with the dignity of the nightborn, but his legs buckled, and he fell to his knees before her on the cold stone step. It felt right. It was the only position from which he could speak to her now. An immortal, kneeling before a mortal. Sarah, he began, his voice a broken thing, a shard of what it once was. He, Theron, silver in the blood, ashwood. I know, she said. Her voice was flat, devoid of triumph, devoid of pity. It was the voice of a fact. The sky is blue, water is wet. Your immortal world has ended. I saw the smoke, and I know what burns a nightborn's castle. He looked down at his hands, trembling and stained with his own dark blood, blood that marked him as something other than human. The confession clawed its way up his throat, a raw and agonizing thing. Every word you said was true. Every warning. I called it paranoia. The word tasted like ash in his mouth. I told you to stop bothering me. He looked up at her then, and he let her see all of it, the shame, the regret, the self-loathing that was a more potent poison than any silver. I was a fool, a blind, arrogant fool. I am nightborn. I am immortal. I have walked this earth for over a century, and yet I was blind to what a mortal woman could see clearly. He let out a choked, desperate sound that was half laugh, half sob. My kingdom is gone. My friends are dead. My castle is ash. All because I wouldn't listen, because I was too proud to believe that a mortal could see something I couldn't, that you— His voice broke. He reached out, his pale hand shaking, but he stopped short of touching her. The gesture hung in the air between them, a plea. They're all dead, Sarah. The loyal ones. A boy named Tom, a mortal boy. He died for me. For something like me. She watched him, her expression unchanging. The stillness was her shield, he realized, the one she had to raise when he had forced her to put his down. He could see the years of his dismissals in the rigid set of her shoulders, the caution in her eyes. He had taught her this stillness. He had created this distance. I am not asking for forgiveness, he whispered, his voice raw. I don't deserve it. I am not asking you to protect me anymore. I am I am begging for a chance. A chance to prove that I see you now. Let me guard you, the way you always guarded me. Let me earn back a fraction of what I threw away. Let an immortal prove he can learn from a mortal. He fell silent, the confession spent. He was empty, broken on her doorstep at dawn. His immortal life was in her mortal hands. It always had been. He just hadn't known it. He waited for her judgment, for her to turn him away, to leave him to the hunters and sunlight that were surely coming. It was what he deserved. She looked at him for a long moment, the silence stretching until it was taut with the weight of everything unsaid between them for 12 years. Then, she shifted her gaze from his face to the bloody, mangled wound in his shoulder. Her expression flickered, just for a second. A hint of something, not pity but a deep, weary pragmatism, the instinct of a protector who cannot, even now, ignore a wound that needs tending. Even a nightborn's wound. She stepped back, pulling the door open wider. "The blood will draw hunters," she said, her voice still quiet, still distant. "Get inside, the sun is rising." It was not forgiveness, it was not acceptance, but it was not rejection. For now, it was enough. It was everything. She made him sit on a low stool by the hearth while she gathered her supplies. The cottage was small, just one room, but it was clean and orderly. Bunches of dried herbs hung from the rafters, some of them wolfsbane and vervain, herbs that could weaken the nightborn if used improperly. She knew what he was. She had always known. A simple cot stood in one corner, a rough-spun blanket folded neatly upon it. There was a small table with one chair. It was a space built for one mortal life, a life lived in daylight. He was an intruder here, a nocturnal, bleeding disruption to her peace. She came back with a basin of hot water, clean cloths, and several jars. She knelt before him and began to cut away the ruined fabric of his tunic. Her movements were efficient, impersonal. He had seen her tend to an injured hawk once with the same focused detachment. He was a problem to be solved, a wound to be cleaned, even if that wound belonged to something that shouldn't exist. He flinched when she reached the ashwood stake still embedded in his shoulder. "This will hurt," she said matter-of-factly. "Your kind cannot heal while wood remains in the wound." "I know," he said through gritted teeth. She gripped the stake and pulled. The pain was immediate and absolute, a white-hot agony that would have killed a mortal. He threw his head back, a sound of pure anguish tearing from his throat, his red eyes blazing brighter for a moment before dimming again. She set the bloodied ashwood aside and immediately began cleaning the wound. "Be still," she commanded, her voice soft but firm. He forced himself to remain motionless as she worked. Her fingers were deft, surprisingly strong. He watched her face, the furrow of concentration between her brows. He saw the faint silvery scar that ran along her jawline, a memento from a bar fight she'd broken up in the city's underbelly while investigating a threat against him 2 years ago. A threat from hunters who sought Nightborn. He had never asked her where she got it. He had never noticed it enough to ask. How many other scars did she carry for him? "The silver," he said, his voice rough. "How did you—" He trailed off, realizing the foolishness of the question. Of course she knew. "Liquefied and blessed," she said without looking up, her focus entirely on her task. "Mixed with fresh blood to mask the scent and taste. A Theron family specialty, they were hunters 3 generations ago, before they sought power through service instead of slaughter. I tried to tell you. Their bloodline has always known how to kill your kind." She reached for one of her jars, this one containing a dark paste. "This will draw out the silver. It will hurt almost as much as the ashwood. Your healing should begin within a day, but silver poisoning, especially at this concentration, can take weeks to fully purge from a Nightborn system. You will be weak for some time." She applied the paste to his wounds, and he hissed as it burned, fighting the poison in his system. She bound his shoulder tightly with clean linen strips, her hands moving with practiced ease. When she was done, she stood and washed her hands, the water turning dark with his blood. "There is broth on the hearth," she said, then paused, a flicker of something crossing her face, perhaps embarrassment. "I apologize." "You do not. I should not have." "It's all right," he said quietly. "The smell of mortal food no longer bothers me. It is comforting, in a way." A reminder of what I once was. She nodded slowly. Then rest. The sun is fully up now. You will be safe here until nightfall. Your horse is outside. I will tend to it. Sarah, he started, needing to fill the sterile silence between them. She turned, and for the first time, a flicker of emotion crossed her face. It was not anger. It was something far worse. It was a profound, bottomless weariness. Do not, she said, her voice low. Do not speak. There is nothing to say. You are here because you are wounded and hunted. I will not turn a wounded creature out, whatever it is. That is all this is. She gestured to the cot. Sleep there. I have work to do in the garden. The daylight is mine now, as the night is yours. He wanted to protest, to insist on some other arrangement, but his body was already failing him. The silver poison, the ashwood wound, the coming of dawn, all of it was pulling him toward the death-like sleep of the nightborn. He moved to the cot and lay down, pulling the rough blanket over him. Through increasingly heavy eyelids, he watched her move about the cottage, deliberately putting distance between them. As the sleep took him, deeper and more vulnerable than any mortal rest, his last thought was that he had brought danger to the one place of peace she had built. He had brought the darkness to her light. The days that followed blurred into a routine of pain and silence. Damon's body healed with agonizing slowness despite his nightborn nature. The silver poisoning had damaged him deeply, and the weakness lingered. For the first few days, he could do little more than move from the cot to the stool by the fire during the evening hours. The daylight was torture for his weakened body, forcing him into a sleep so deep it resembled death. He would wake at dusk, disoriented and aching, to find Sarah returning from her day's work, smelling of earth and sunlight, things he could no longer fully enjoy. He watched her, and in watching, he began to learn. He saw that her life was a tapestry of deliberate actions. She rose before the sun, her movements quiet and purposeful. She checked the snares she had set in the woods, not for sport, but for sustenance. She tended her small garden with a gentle hand, speaking to the plants as she watered them. She mended her clothes with neat, tiny stitches. Nothing was wasted. Nothing was unplanned. Her entire existence was built on the principles he had ignored: awareness, preparation, and a deep understanding of the subtle currents of the world around her. She lived by the sun. He existed in the darkness. They were opposites in every way. He tried to help. On the fourth evening, feeling a sliver of his strength return, he saw her preparing to chop wood for the night's fire. "Let me," he said, pushing himself to his feet. She stopped and looked at him, then at his bandaged shoulder, then at his pale, trembling hands. She didn't say a word. She just held out the axe. He took it. Despite his supernatural strength beginning to return, the tool felt foreign in his grip. He had been a warrior, yes, but with swords meant for killing, not tools meant for living. He positioned a log on the chopping block and swung. The blow was clumsy, glancing off the wood and jarring his injured shoulder. He cried out, dropping the axe and stumbling back, his arm a blaze of fresh pain. Sarah stepped forward, picked up the axe, and with one smooth, efficient motion, split the log perfectly in two. She did not look at him. She did not say anything. She simply continued her work, splitting log after log until a neat pile was stacked by the door. His uselessness was a humiliation more profound than any defeat in battle. He was immortal, possessed of supernatural strength, and yet he could not perform a simple mortal task. He retreated to the cottage, his shoulder throbbing, his face burning with shame. He resolved to start smaller. The next evening, he took the water buckets. The well was a short walk from the cottage. It was a simple task. He managed it, just barely, his arms shaking with the effort, sloshing half the water onto the ground on his way back. When he returned, panting despite his night-born lungs, Sarah was there. She looked at the half-empty buckets, then at him. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was not praise, it was acknowledgement. He had completed a task. He had contributed. It felt like a monumental victory. He learned to be silent. He had spent his life filling rooms with his voice, his opinions, his commands. Here, his words were useless. So he listened. He listened to the sound of her breathing as she slept, her mortal heartbeat a steady rhythm that he found strangely comforting. He listened to the way she spoke to the merchants who occasionally came by her cottage, her tone changing subtly, gauging their intent, deflecting their curiosity. He began to hear the things she heard. The snap of a twig in the woods that was not a squirrel. The change in the birdsong that signaled an approaching stranger. His night-born senses, once dulled by arrogance, became sharp again through her teaching. One evening, a week after his arrival, she was preparing their separate meals. She cooked mortal food for herself while heating blood for him. Animal blood she had procured from a sympathetic butcher in the village, claiming it was for medicinal salves and poultices, knowledge the herbalist woman was known to possess. The butcher never questioned her, accepting her coin and her discretion. He sat nearby, watching her hands work. "How did you know?" he asked, his voice quiet, careful not to break the fragile peace of the room. "About Theron. How were you so sure?" She paused, considering whether to answer. Finally she spoke, her eyes still on her work. "He was too perfect," she said. "His reports never had errors. His advice was always exactly what you wanted to hear." People are not perfect, Damon. They are messy. They make mistakes. They have vanities and fears. Theron had none. It was a mask. A well-made one, but a mask nonetheless. And I have learned that the men who wear the most perfect masks are the ones with the most to hide. She looked at him then, and her gaze was direct, analytical. You surrounded yourself with mirrors, men who would only show you your own reflection. You never wanted windows. And perhaps that is the curse of your kind, of the Nightborn. You live so long that you forget mortals change, that loyalty can be bought, that time makes traitors of the most faithful servants' descendants. The truth of it struck him. He had promoted men who agreed with him, who flattered him, who made him feel secure in his own judgment. He had built an echo chamber and called it a kingdom. Sarah had been his only window, and he had shuttered it. Worse, he had done so with the arrogance of immortality, believing his extended years gave him wisdom, when they had only given him blind certainty. He said nothing, only nodded, accepting the lesson. This was his penance. Not just the physical tasks, the chopping of wood and the carrying of water, but this, the slow, painful dismantling of the man, the immortal, he had been. He had to unlearn over a century of arrogance. He had to learn to see the world not as a map to be commanded, but as a forest full of shadows and truths, a place to be navigated with caution and respect. He began his own vigil. The Nightborn did not need sleep every night, and so he used the wakeful hours. While Sarah slept, he would sit outside the cottage door in the darkness that was his natural element. He would watch the woods with eyes that could see in pitch black. He would listen with ears that could hear a heartbeat from 50 paces. He was a pathetic guard by her standards, lacking her intuition and her network of information. But he was present. He was watching. It was a promise he was making to the darkness, to himself, to the sleeping woman inside. He would not be blind again. He would learn to see. And he would use his Nightborn gifts not for domination, but for protection. A month bled into 2. The autumn deepened, the air growing colder. The last of the leaves fell, leaving the trees as stark, black skeletons against gray skies. Damon's wound healed completely, leaving a puckered scar on his shoulder, a permanent mark on his otherwise flawless Nightborn skin. His strength returned fully, the supernatural power of his kind flowing through him once more. But he was different now. He could chop a cord of wood in minutes with his inhuman strength, but he did it slowly, carefully, mindful of the cottage and Sarah's safety. He could carry 6 buckets of water at once, but he carried two, the same as she would. He learned to track, his predator's instincts now used to read the forest for threats rather than prey. He learned which herbs could harm his kind and which could heal mortals. Sarah taught him, not with lectures, but with actions. She would point to a plant in the moonlight, raise an eyebrow, and wait for him to identify it. She would hand him an herb, and he was expected to know its use. He was her apprentice in the art of mortal survival, the art she had mastered and he had forgotten in his centuries of immortal remove. The silence between them changed. It was no longer the sterile, empty silence of the first few weeks. It became a shared space, comfortable, filled with unspoken understanding. They would work side by side in the evening garden, when twilight allowed him to be outside without pain, for an hour without speaking. Yet he felt more connected to her in those moments than he had in a decade of stilted conversations in his throne room. She began to time her work to the hours he could join her, a small concession that meant everything to him. He began to truly guard her. It became more than just a nightly vigil. He noticed the way a traveling merchant's eyes lingered on her a moment too long, and positioned himself between them, his red eyes flashing in the lamplight, a silent warning. He overheard two villagers gossiping about the woman in the woods who kept company with strange, pale visitors at night, and he appeared behind them from the shadows, his presence alone enough to send them running. He was protecting her, not just from physical dangers, but from the small, sharp cruelties of the world, the suspicions and fears that mortals harbored. He was deflecting the whispers, just as she had once done for him. He never spoke of his old life. He never called himself a king. That immortal ruler was dead, burned in the fires of his own castle. He was just Damon now, a nightborn living in a small cottage with a mortal woman. But the world had not forgotten him. One evening, as the sun set, a man stumbled out of the woods. He was thin and ragged, his clothes little more than tatters. He saw Damon by the woodpile, and his eyes widened, first in fear, then in disbelief, then in recognition of the distinctive silver hair and red eyes. "Your Grace," he whispered, falling to his knees. "You are alive. The Nightborn King lives." Damon recognized him. He was one of the palace guards, a man named Marcus who had been loyal. "Marcus, what happened? How did you find me?" "We fled," the man said, his voice hoarse. "Those of us who would not turn. We have been living in the hills, like bandits. Theron, he calls himself Lord Regent now, has put a bounty on your head, on any who were loyal to you. He has hunters, real hunters, searching for you. They say he promised them your head, proof that the Nightborn King is truly dead. We heard whispers from the refugees, people fleeing the city, that you had survived the fire. Some spoke of a pale rider on a dying horse heading toward the Tanglewood. We followed the trail, found the horse's tracks, and tracked them here." He looked past Damon to the cottage and saw Sarah standing in the doorway, watching them. The guard's face hardened. With her, the shadow. Damon stepped in front of him, his red eyes flashing with warning. "She saved my life. She is a shadow, a bad omen," Marcus said, fear and superstition warring with his old loyalty. "They say in the city that she cursed you, that she brought this all down upon us, that she bewitched you, made you weak, made you vulnerable to mortal treachery. The injustice of it was a hot brand against Damon's soul. They blamed her. The city, his people, what was left of them, blamed the one person who had tried to save them all. Theron had no doubt spread the rumors himself. A convenient scapegoat, playing on mortal fears of those who lived in the shadows, conflating her with the darkness of the Nightborn. "You are wrong," Damon said, his voice low and cold with a fury he had not felt in months, the ancient power of his kind making the air around them chill. "I did this. My pride, my blindness. She was the only one who saw the truth, the only one who was loyal. You will not speak of her that way." The guard stared at him, at the fierce, protective anger in his eyes, at the way he stood before her cottage like a sentinel. He saw not a king defending a subject, but an immortal defending his home. Marcus bowed his head. "Forgive me, Your Grace. We are desperate." Damon learned from Marcus that a small band of loyalists, no more than 50 mortals, were hiding in the hills. They were starving, hunted by Theron's men and professional hunters alike. They needed a leader. They needed their king. They needed the Nightborn who could fight in darkness, who could move unseen, who could protect them from the night's dangers. That night, the cottage felt small, constricting. The outside world had found them. Damon stood by the window, staring out into the darkness that was his domain. His past had come for him. He could feel the old mantle of kingship settling on his shoulders, and it was heavier than ever before, weighted now with the knowledge of what his blindness had cost. Sarah came to stand beside him. She did not touch him, but he could feel her presence, her warm, mortal heartbeat, a quiet anchor in the storm of his thoughts. "You have to go to them," she said. It was not a question. "I cannot leave you," he replied, the words torn from him. The thought of leaving this small, quiet sanctuary, of leaving her, was terrifying in a way that centuries of existence had not prepared him for. "They are being hunted because of you," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "You have a duty." He turned to her, his face etched with turmoil, his red eyes reflecting the lamplight. "My duty was to you, to protect you. I failed. I will not fail again. I will not leave you unprotected." She looked at him, and for the first time in months, he saw a genuine, unguarded emotion in her eyes. It was a faint, sad smile. "Look at you, Damon," she whispered. "You stand in a borrowed cottage, with nothing to your name but a scar and a handful of loyal mortals, and your first thought is of your duty, of protecting others." She reached out, and her fingers brushed against the back of his pale hand, her warmth against his coolness. "You are not the man, the king, who sent me away." He looked down at her hand, so close to his, mortal warmth touching immortal cold. "That man is dead. That king is dead." "No," she said, her voice barely audible. "He is not dead. He is finally awake." He knew she was right. He had to go. He had to lead what was left of his people, mortal and loyal. He had to fight Theron, not for a throne, but for the memory of the boy who died for him, for the loyal guard starving in the hills, for the kingdom he had so carelessly broken. And he had to do it not as the arrogant immortal he had been, but as the protector he should have been all along. "I will come back," he said, and it was a vow spoken with the weight of immortality behind it. "I know," she replied, and in her eyes he saw not the doubt and distance of the past months, but a flicker of something else, something he thought he had lost forever. It looked like trust. He left the next evening at dusk. He took nothing with him but the clothes on his back and a small blade Sarah had given him, silver, ironically, blessed and deadly to his own kind, but a symbol of her trust that he would use it only against his enemies. She stood in the doorway and watched him go, her figure framed by the warm lamplight of the cottage. He did not look back. He had a promise to keep. The fight was not a grand war of armies clashing on open fields. It was a thing of shadows and whispers, the very kind of war Sarah had always fought, and now the kind of war the Nightborn king would fight. Damon and his small band of loyalists became ghosts in the woods, insurgents striking at Theron's supply lines under cover of darkness, freeing political prisoners from dungeons the Nightborn king could infiltrate unseen, and spreading the truth of the Lord Regent's betrayal. Damon used the skills Sarah had taught him, combined with his supernatural abilities. He moved with inhuman silence. He listened with preternatural hearing. He learned to see the weaknesses in his enemy's defenses with both immortal senses and mortal cunning. He was not fighting like a king. He was fighting like her. And he was fighting like what the Nightborn should have always been, protectors in the darkness, not tyrants of the night. Weeks turned into a brutal winter. News would occasionally reach him of Sarah. Travelers spoke of the quiet woman in the Tanglewood cottage who offered a hot meal to refugees and whose knowledge of herbs had saved more than one child from winter fever. She was becoming a legend in her own right, a quiet symbol of resilience in a broken land. Theron, hearing these same rumors through his network of spies, began to piece together the connection. The woman in the woods was the former shadow of the Nightborn King, the one who had disappeared weeks before the coup, the one whose absence had made the assassination possible. He had initially believed she had perished in the castle fire, trapped in some forgotten corridor, or consumed by the flames like so many others. But the reports of a dark-haired woman with extensive knowledge of herbs and a quiet strength, living exactly where a fleeing king might seek refuge, told him otherwise. She had not only survived, but was now harboring refugees, spreading hope, becoming a symbol. And if the rumors of a pale figure in the night were true, she might still be protecting the Nightborn King. Theron decided she was a threat he could not ignore. He could not have the people finding hope in anyone, especially not someone associated with the deposed Nightborn King. He dispatched a squad of his most ruthless men, a mixed group of soldiers and professional hunters equipped with silver and ashwood, with simple orders. Burn the cottage and kill the woman who lived there. One of Damon's scouts brought him the news. They had intercepted one of the assassins. The rest were already on their way. A cold, primal fear seized Damon, sharper and more terrible than any he had felt in over a century of existence, sharper even than the fear he'd felt in the fire of his castle. They were going after her. Because of him. His war had once again brought danger to her doorstep. He took his 5 best fighters and they rode through the night, pushing their horses to their limits, racing against time. But the journey that should have taken a day and a half at normal pace would still take too long. They were 2 days away. It would be too late. The thought was a dagger in his heart, the heart that should not beat, but somehow ached with mortal pain. And then he made a decision that went against every instinct of his kind. As dawn approached, he did not stop. He wrapped himself in heavy cloaks and pushed forward into the daylight. The sun burned his skin through the fabric, a constant searing pain that grew worse with each passing hour. His men protested, begged him to take shelter, but he refused. By midday, his skin beneath the cloaks was blistering, the exposed parts of his face raw and red. The pain was excruciating, worse than the ashwood, worse than the silver, because it was constant and unrelenting. But he did not stop. By evening of the first day, when he finally allowed himself to rest as the sun set, his skin was badly damaged, his strength nearly gone. But he had gained half a day. He rested for 3 hours, let his body begin its healing, and then pushed forward through the second night. As dawn approached again, he repeated the torture, riding through the second day wrapped in his cloaks, his skin burning, his vision blurring from the pain. His men rode in awed silence, watching their Nightborn King endure what should have been impossible. By the time night fell on the second day, they were there. He was barely conscious, his skin raw and blistered, his supernatural healing struggling to cope with the extent of the damage. But he was there. From the ridge overlooking the clearing, he saw it. The cottage was dark. No smoke rose from the chimney. His heart stopped. But there were no signs of fire, no smell of smoke, just an unnerving stillness. He dismounted, nearly falling, and motioning for his men to stay back, he approached on foot, his red eyes piercing the darkness despite his weakened state. The clearing was a tapestry of death. He found the first body by the woodpile, a man in Theron's livery with a crossbow bolt in his throat. He found 2 more near the well, their necks broken with precision that spoke of training. Another lay by the cottage door, a simple paring knife, the same one she used to cut apples, buried to the hilt in his eye. Damon's blood ran cold, or colder than its usual temperature. He pushed open the door. The cottage was empty. A fire was laid in the hearth, ready to be lit. A bowl of apples sat on the table. It was as if she had just stepped out for a moment. But on the floor, near the hearth, lay the last two assassins. One had a deep gash across his chest, the wound precise and fatal. The other had been killed by a heavy iron poker, the one that always rested by the hearth, now buried in his skull. Damon slowly pieced it together. They had come for her. All 6 of them, soldiers and hunters. Men trained to kill, and men trained specifically to hunt beings like him. And she had been ready. She had hunted the hunters. She had used her knowledge of the woods, her snares, her silence, her absolute refusal to be a victim. She had not needed him. She had never truly needed him to protect her from the physical world. She had only ever needed him to see her, to believe in her, to trust her. He backed out of the cottage, his mind reeling. Where was she? He scanned the woods with his supernatural sight, and then he saw it. A flicker of movement in the trees at the far edge of the clearing. It was her. She was standing there, a bow in her hand, watching him. She had been watching the entire time, waiting to see who was friend and who was foe, waiting to see if she would need to kill him too. He dropped his defensive stance and held his hands out, palms open. "Sarah," he called out, his voice hoarse with relief. She stepped out of the shadows, moving into the moonlight that illuminated her for him. She was unhurt, but her face was grim, her eyes hard from the violence of the night. She looked at the bodies, then at him, at his burned skin, raw and blistered, barely beginning to heal, at his exhausted stance, at the evidence of what he had endured to reach her. "You came," she said, and there was something in her voice, a crack in the careful distance she had maintained. "I told you I would," he replied, his heart, that traitorous organ, aching with a mixture of awe and regret. "I came to protect you." A small, wry smile touched her lips, though her eyes glistened with something that might have been tears. "It seems we had the same idea." She took a step closer, her eyes traveling over his damaged skin, the burns that marked his daylight ride. "You rode through the sun." It was not a question, but he answered anyway. "I could not be too late. Not again." He closed the distance between them, stopping a few feet away. He looked at her, truly looked at her with his immortal eyes that could see every detail in the darkness. Not as a shadow, not as a protector, not as a mystery to be solved, but as the woman who had survived everything, including him. The mortal woman who had just single-handedly defeated 6 trained killers. The woman whose mortality made her more alive, more fierce, more real than his centuries of existence had ever made him. "I was so afraid," he admitted, the words raw and vulnerable, in a way the Nightborn King had never allowed himself to be. "Afraid I would be too late. That I would lose you before I had the chance to." He trailed off, unable to articulate the immensity of what he felt. How did an immortal explain that a mortal had become his entire world? She looked at his face, at the genuine fear and desperation etched there, at the burns on his skin from riding through daylight. She saw the king who had ridden for 2 days without rest, through the burning sun that pained his kind, not to reclaim a throne, but to save one mortal woman. The wall she had so carefully rebuilt around her heart, the one that had been tested and patched and reinforced for months, finally dissolved. It did not crumble. It simply vanished, as if it had never been there at all. This time, she was the one who moved first. She took a step toward him, and another. She laid her bow on the ground. She looked up into his red eyes, and the weariness, the caution, the years of hurt were gone. In their place was a clear, steady light. He reached for her, his movements slow, hesitant, giving her every chance to pull away. His pale hands, cool to the touch, cupped her face. He felt the warmth of her mortal skin, the pulse of her heartbeat against his palms, the evidence of her vibrant, finite, precious life. She leaned into his touch, and he drew her into his arms, holding her with a gentleness that belied the supernatural strength he possessed. He buried his face in her dark hair, breathing in the scent of wood smoke and dried herbs and living mortal warmth. It was the scent of home. She was not stiff or distant in his embrace. She melted against him, her arms wrapping around his waist, holding on as if she too had been afraid of being too late. They stood there for a long time, in the quiet clearing surrounded by the bodies of their enemies, under a sky full of cold, distant stars that he had watched for over a century, but never truly seen until now. It was not an end to their war, but it was a moment of absolute peace. Immortal and mortal, darkness and light, finally meeting without fear. "I swear to you, Sarah," he whispered against her hair, his voice thick with an emotion so powerful it felt like it could remake the world, an emotion he had thought lost to him in his long immortal years. "I will spend the rest of my life, every day I have left, every endless night of my existence, earning this. Earning you." She did not answer with words. She simply held him tighter, her mortal warmth against his immortal cold, a silent acknowledgement of a vow that had finally been made, and a promise that had, at long last, been kept. The night-born king was gone, but in his place stood an immortal worthy of his mortal guardian, and a new night, one they would face together, was about to begin.